I'm Micah McBay. I'm the Director of Modern Worship and Community Connections, and I am pleased to be here this morning to fill in for Matt, who is recovering well from a hip replacement surgery, and you'll be glad to know that he'll be back leading his salsa dancing class next week. Thank you. I worked on that in between, so I'm glad. So let's open with Scripture this morning from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 17, verses 5 through 8. The Lord proclaims, "Cursed are those who trust in mere humans, who depend on human strength and turn their hearts from the Lord. They will be like a desert shrub that doesn't know when relief comes. They will live in the parched places of the wilderness, in a barren land where no one survives. Happy are those who trust in the Lord, who rely on the Lord. They will be like trees planted by the streams, whose roots reach down to the water. They won't fear drought when it comes. Their leaves will remain green. They won't be stressed in the time of drought or fail to bear fruit." It's the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. My message this morning concerns a phrase that I heard for the first time on the television program, Ted Lasso. And if you come into my office, you'll see a poster on the wall with a picture of the actor Jason Sudeikis, who plays the role of Ted Lasso in the television program. It has a very long quote from the television show next to it. But the phrase from that television program that was attributed to Walt Whitman, and I'm unclear, the internet is unclear on if Mr. Whitman actually said this or not, but regardless of where it came from, the phrase that I want to focus on today is this: be curious, not judgmental. Be curious, not judgmental. I believe that when we are curious and not judgmental, we become like that tree planted by streams of living water, whose leaf doesn't fade and who bears fruit in its season. And before I begin, I want to mention two things really quickly, because I anticipate through the course of the message that two ideas may pop into your head and you may have questions. And I want to let you know that I do not have time to answer those questions today, but that I am going to answer them on my Facebook devotional tomorrow at 9 a.m. that I do every Monday, and then the second the following week. And those two questions are this. Number one, well, Micah, be curious, not judgmental, and the things that you said sound interesting, but what about my opinion? What about opinions? I'm going to talk about that tomorrow morning on my Facebook devotional at 9. Then the second question you may have is, well, I hear what you're saying, but what about judgments in society? What do we do about crime? How do we deal with judgment in that aspect? I'll talk about that the following Monday. There's just not enough time to unpack all of that unless you all want to stay here until 12:30, and you don't. So let's frame what I mean when I say curiosity and when I say judgment for the talk today. Judgment is what happens when we make a diagnosis and we cut something off. Judgment is about saying, this is as far as I'm willing to go and no further. I understand this much, and that's enough for me. Or I understand this within a certain framework, and you're outside of that framework, and because you don't fit into my framework, no. Whereas curiosity is saying, I'm open. I want to see what's next. I want to learn. I want to grow. I want to change. It looks for possibilities because curiosity knows that it doesn't know. I think curiosity helps us in a couple of specific ways. The first way is that it helps us when we encounter something that's new or something that's different. When we encounter something new or different, if we judge it, that is when we take our framework of thought, our perspective, and we say, I don't understand how you fit. And because I don't understand how you fit, no. It's about cutting things off. That's what happens when we judge. It ends possibilities for the new or the unknown, and it stops us from changing. Now, you may have heard a term, gauche. The term gauche. It means that it's not in fashion. It means that it's not appropriate, that it's somehow wrong. It sort of has the connotation of bleh, right? Something that's gauche. And it's spelled Gauche because it's from the French, and French people can't spell. And pardon if you're French, I don't understand your language. But it is Gauche and it's pronounced gauche. It comes from the Middle Ages. So it's a term that dates back hundreds of years that is not as much in use today, but is still in our English language. So we've taken a word from French into English, hundreds of years old, used it the same way for hundreds of years. Does anybody speak French and know what gauche means? Gauche means left. The term comes from the fact that just like today, in the Middle Ages, there are people who were left-handed. And rather than being curious and saying, why are you left-handed and not right-handed? The right-handed people of the world, who still in 2022 dominate the world, and if you are a left-handed person, you can nod and go, I know exactly what you mean. The world is not designed for left-handed people. And in 2022, we still say something is gauche. That's a judgment. We could have been curious and said, why are people left-handed? What makes left-handed people use the left hand instead of the right? Now, we've done that over the last few decades, but all of you who are of a certain age who are left-handed can come and tell a story about how when you were in elementary school, your teacher told you, you can't write that way. Learn how to use your right hand. Or if you just couldn't do it, then you do that thing that left-handed people do that I do not understand because I'm right-handed, and I don't know how you write this way, left-handed people, but you do this. You seen left-handed people do this? And they write this way. And do you know why? So that the pen or the pencil will slant at the same angle, because the teacher doesn't know how to teach you how to write left-handed because they're likely right-handed. Rather than being curious and looking for an alternative, we've made a judgment and cut people off in the process. Curiosity seeks to explore, to learn. The goal is understanding, it's expanding. It forgoes placing judgments on the unknown. Albert Einstein, one of the most brilliant people who has ever walked on the face of the earth, said, I have no special talents. I'm only passionately curious. What would the world look like if we all behaved that way? The second thing I think curiosity does for us is that it helps us in our relationships, not just with other people, but with ourselves. As I've said, judgment draws sharp, definitive, hard lines. Judgment leaves no room for grace. It leaves no room for empathy. It leaves no room for compassion. In a book called Nonviolent Communication by Dr. Marshall Rosenberg, which I highly recommend, he writes about anger and the root of anger. And he argues that anger comes from not what someone else has done to you, but because you have an unmet need within. And the way we get through anger and past anger is self-discovery. It's being curious about ourselves, understanding where the unmet need is, so that we can express that, we can communicate that with the other person in the hopes of finding reconciliation, empathy, and compassion. There's a wonderful line from the book series, The Lord of the Rings, and if you haven't read that, I highly recommend it, or you can watch the movies. The books are better, but you can watch the movies that came out 20 some odd years ago. And there's this wonderful line in it in which one of the characters, the old wise wizard named Gandalf, right? I'm looking to my friend Joel, who I know is a Lord of the Rings fan like me. And he has a conversation with the main character who is a hobbit named Frodo. And in this conversation, Frodo has just said to the old wizard, Gandalf, he has said to him, that creature should die. He deserves death. And let me read you what Gandalf says in response. Deserves it? I dare say he does. Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death in judgment For even the very wise cannot see all ends. Even the very wise cannot see all ends. When we judge, we are taking on the role of God. We are assuming that we can see all ends. We are assuming that there is no more information to be had, that there is nothing else to learn, and we stop and we make a judgment. As opposed to being curious. And when we're curious, we hold things loosely. We allow for growth and change. We delight in the different without forcing it to adapt to our standards, with an understanding that that is not our job or our role, that we are not God, and that the world should not revolve around our whims, and that there is room for everyone. Indeed, in the book of Luke, we find a wonderful story about curiosity. It's about a man, a short man, who was extremely curious about this man, Jesus. And he'd heard all of these stories, and he needed to go and find out who this Jesus was. So he went and he searched, and there was a crowd, as there always was around Jesus, the scriptures tell us. And this man decided, I must know more about this Jesus. So he climbed up a sycamore tree. And you may remember from your Sunday school lessons when you were a kid, the man's name was Zacchaeus. His curiosity led to an encounter with Jesus that changed the course of his life. Now, he could have taken the tack that the Pharisees and the Sadducees took. They judged Jesus. They did not think Jesus had anything to say to them. They did not think Jesus had anything worthwhile. They closed themselves off. They were not open. And what did that lead to? It always leads to death. So there are three ways, I think, that we can implement this. So you say, okay, maybe you agree. All right, this sounds lovely. Curiosity can change things. So what? How? Right? Let me give you three different things. The first is openness. Openness is the key to curiosity. On the NPR program Hidden Brain, which always has something interesting to say, there was a researcher that I heard this week that was talking about research that she had done about something she termed the liking gap. Liking. And what she discovered in her research is that when two people meet each other for the first time, both people assume that the other person doesn't like them. And research shows that is not true. The other person actually likes you much more than you think. And what happens is we close ourselves off. We try to protect ourselves. We turn inward. And we're very careful about what we want to say to somebody, not knowing the whole time that the other person is immensely curious about us, that the other person actually does like us. And if you take nothing else today, please hear me say, you are worth being liked. You have value. You have purpose. You are loved. So when you think people don't like you, guess what? They do. And the way that we discover this is through openness. When we open ourselves to other people and we let our guard down a little bit, understanding that those other people really do like us, then we can develop and grow in relationships. And guess what? That works for yourself too. Self-hate is a real thing, and you can also like yourself. That's okay too. So first, we remain open. Second, we have to learn to reframe. And what I mean by that is shifting our perspective on an idea, a subject, a person, a thing, an event, and looking at it from as many angles as we possibly can in order to determine what's true, in order to determine how we feel about that thing, and in order to be as sympathetic, as empathetic, as compassionate as we can towards whatever it is that we're examining. If we only look at it from our limited viewpoint and we make a judgment, then we allow no room for anything to change. But if we reframe, we often find that new doorways open new possibilities. And there's a wonderful old story from China. It's ancient. And it's about a Chinese farmer. And the story goes like this. There was once a Chinese farmer who had a horse and one son. And one morning, the Chinese farmer woke up and discovered that his horse had escaped. And the people of the village came to him and said, "What a tragedy! How awful! Your horse is gone. Whatever will you do? It's so terrible." The Chinese farmer replied, "Maybe." And the next day, he awoke and he looked out in the field and he saw that there was his horse with 7 wild horses. And the people of the village came to him and they said, "How wonderful, what great luck, what great fortune that you've had. You once had 1 horse, now you have 8. You're rich, you're blessed." And the old farmer said, "Maybe." The next day, he awoke and looked outside, and there was his son trying to train one of the wild horses. And as his son was trying to break this wild horse, he was thrown from the horse and he broke his leg. And the villagers came to him that evening and they said, "What a tragedy! How awful! Your son has broken his leg. How will you ever do your farming? It's so terrible." And the Chinese farmer said, "Maybe." And the next day, an army came marching through on their way to war somewhere far beyond their small village. And they took all of the young men who were able-bodied. And when they came to the old Chinese farmer's son, they saw his leg was broken. And they said, "We cannot possibly carry you. We do not have time for your leg to heal." And they left his son behind. And all the villagers came to him and they said, "What a wonderful thing. Isn't it so great and grand that this has happened? Your son has been spared from war." And the old farmer said, "Maybe." Even the very wise cannot see all ends. When we are open, when we learn to reframe and look at things from alternative perspectives, when we behave in a way in which we are curious and not judgmental, we will begin to grow. We will begin to expand spiritually, mentally. Our capacity to love will grow. And if we fail to do this, and we live a life guided and prompted by judgment, we will become like Marty's plant, dry, crispy, unable to continue to grow because we're certain we figured it all out. And this is something that is not tied to age, even though our society tends to do so. We take people who are older and we say, "Well, you must be wise because you've lived all these years." And there is some truth in that. At the same time, if we ever reach the point where we decide we've arrived, this is it, I've gone as far as I can and no further, then we will stop growing. So young people continue to grow and expand. Older people do the same. There is no end. We persist. We continue. We are eternal because God made us that way. And that should be a wonderful and a beautiful idea. And when we behave in this way, we become the fruitful tree, and our leaf does not fade or wither. Dorothy Parker, the poet and writer, said this: "The cure for boredom is curiosity. There is no cure for curiosity." Be curious, not judgmental. In my preparations this week, I discovered on a website from a man named Steve Nash. And I regret to inform you, this is as much as I know about Mr. Nash, except that he wrote this lovely thing that I'm going to use this morning. So if for some reason he ever happens to watch this, thank you, Mr. Nash, for these words that I did not write, but that perfectly fit the message today. And I close with this: be curious, not judgmental. When something happens that you don't want to happen. When you don't get what you want. When somebody else does it better than you. Be curious, not judgmental. When you hear no rather than yes. When it's just taking too long. When you're listening to a story with an obvious ending, be curious, not judgmental. When the same thing keeps happening to you again and 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 again. When somebody is saying something. When somebody is saying anything. When you're having the same negative thoughts inside your head. Be curious, not judgmental. When you feel awful inside, when the world outside feels scary, when you just don't know what to do, be curious, not judgmental. When the path seems to come to an end, when the money runs out, when the words dry up, be curious, not judgmental.